In the early years of the 12th century, the world of Christendom trembled between faith and fire. The First Crusade had ended only a generation before, leaving behind kingdoms of stone and sand, fragile bastions carved into foreign soil. The holy city of Jerusalem, once a distant dream, now stood under the banner of the cross. Yet peace had not come with victory. Roads once soaked in the blood of conquest had become the graves of pilgrims. From every corner of Europe, men and women still journeyed eastward to walk where Christ had walked, and many never returned. They came with rosaries and hope, but the deserts beyond Jaffa were merciless. Bandits haunted the winding passes, and Saracen raiders struck without warning. The Holy Land, redeemed by sword, still demanded sacrifice. Along the dusty pilgrim routes, the bones of the faithful bleached beneath a sun that cared little for faith or empire. Back in Europe, a different struggle brewed, not of swords, but of souls. The knights who once marched beneath holy banners now wandered in search of meaning. Some returned home to their estates burdened by sin, haunted by memories of slaughter. Others turned toward monasteries, seeking peace through prayer. Yet even within cloistered walls, restlessness stirred. The monks of the age asked, is holiness only found in silence, or can it be forged in the clamor of battle? It was an age divided between the sword and the cross, between action and contemplation. But in that tension, something new was waiting to be born. Amid the ruins of Jerusalem's walls, a French knight named Hugh of Payens rode through the dust. He was neither conqueror nor monk, but a man burdened by purpose. Around him, the holy city shimmered, a fragile promise of faith surrounded by endless hostility. As he dismounted near the Temple Mount, he looked upon the land where heaven and earth seemed to wrestle for dominance. In that moment, between devotion and danger, a new idea began to take shape. A brotherhood unlike any before it. A union of prayer and sword. In a land soaked in blood and faith, a new kind of brotherhood was about to be born. The capture of Jerusalem in the year 1099 marked the end of the First Crusade and the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in medieval history. After 3 years of marching across continents, through hunger, disease, and endless battle, the Crusaders had achieved what no one in Europe had truly believed possible, the recovery of Christ's tomb. The news sent waves of jubilation across the Latin West. Churches rang their bells in celebration, kings and bishops proclaimed divine favor, and preachers hailed it as proof that God's will had triumphed over the infidel. Yet, on the ground, the reality was far more complex. The victorious Crusaders found themselves ruling over a land they scarcely understood. They had come as pilgrims and warriors, but now they were lords of conquered territories. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was established with its capital in the Holy City itself. Alongside it stood 3 smaller Crusader states, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Together, they formed a fragile chain of Christian enclaves stretching along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Their rulers, men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Baldwin of Boulogne, and Bohemond of Taranto, were not kings in the European sense, but rather custodians of faith, bound to defend the Holy Sepulchre and the land surrounding it. Yet these new Christian realms were isolated. They were small islands of Latin power surrounded by vast Muslim territories. The majority of their populations were not Latin at all, but local peoples, Greek and Syriac Christians, Armenians, Arabs, and Jews, each with their own languages, traditions, and loyalties. The Latin settlers were few in number, perhaps only a few thousand knights and a handful of clergy, supported by an even smaller population of European colonists. Most Crusaders who had taken Jerusalem returned home soon after victory. Those who stayed behind faced a monumental task, to govern and defend a kingdom where they were strangers. Life in the new Kingdom of Jerusalem was a constant balancing act. The Latins depended heavily on the cooperation of the local Christian communities, many of whom had lived under Muslim rule for centuries. These groups often provided administrative support, translators, and local knowledge. Markets thrived in cities like Acre and Tyre, where merchants from Italy and the Levant traded in spices, glass, and textiles. The holy city itself became a cosmopolitan center where pilgrims, monks, and soldiers rubbed shoulders in its narrow streets. Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Armenian voices mingled in the air, and the call to prayer from Muslim quarters still echoed faintly over the rooftops, even under Christian rule. But beneath this fragile coexistence lay constant danger. The Crusader states were militarily weak and economically dependent on supply lines stretching thousands of miles back to Europe. The surrounding Muslim powers, Egypt under the Fatimids and Syria under the Seljuks, saw the Latin presence as a temporary intrusion, one that would soon be erased. Skirmishes were frequent, border raids common, and the threat of full-scale invasion was never far away. The roads between coastal ports and Jerusalem were treacherous, patrolled by bandits and raiders who preyed upon travelers and pilgrims. Pilgrimage had been the beating heart of medieval faith long before the Crusades. To walk in the footsteps of Christ was to participate in salvation itself. The victory of 1099 had opened those roads once more, and thousands of men and women from across Europe began to make the long journey east. But the paths they traveled were perilous. Many were ambushed before they even reached the holy city. Caravans disappeared in the wilderness between Jaffa and Jerusalem. Entire groups of pilgrims were slaughtered or taken as slaves. The same zeal that had sent knights across the world to capture the Holy Sepulchre now confronted a sobering truth: the Holy Land was won, but it could not yet be safely reached. Reports of these dangers soon reached the courts and churches of Europe. Chroniclers wrote of pilgrims stripped and beaten, of corpses left unburied on the pilgrim roads, of relics lost to robbers. To those who had fought in the Crusade, this was an outrage. They had risked everything to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom, only to see his followers die in the dust. Among the knightly class, a question began to stir. What greater service could a man render than to protect those who journeyed for God? This question was not a simple one. The medieval world drew sharp distinctions between those who prayed and those who fought. Monks lived apart from the world, dedicating themselves to prayer, fasting, and contemplation. Knights lived in the world, their duty bound to warfare and earthly loyalty. The Crusades had blurred that line, offering knights a sacred purpose, but when the wars ended, the old divisions returned. Many warriors struggled to reconcile their violent lives with the peace demanded by the Church. Could a man of the sword truly serve God? Could war ever be holy? Theologians of the time were divided. Some saw the crusade as a divinely ordained act of penitence. Others warned that killing, even for a righteous cause, could never be reconciled with the teachings of Christ. The Church preached peace among Christians, but called for war against the enemies of faith. It was a moral tension that defined the age, a paradox between piety and bloodshed. In this moral landscape, the concept of the warrior for God began to take root. The First Crusade had revealed that warfare, when guided by faith, could be seen as a form of devotion. Yet the idea lacked structure and legitimacy. Most knights still fought for lords or kings, not for the Church directly. There were no religious orders dedicated to arms, no codified path for a warrior seeking salvation through battle. The notion of combining the discipline of the monastery with the courage of the battlefield was at this point only a whisper on the edge of imagination. Jerusalem itself stood as a symbol of this tension. Its holy places had been restored and sanctified, but its streets were lined with soldiers. Monks prayed at dawn within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, while guards stood watch at its gates. Processions of barefoot pilgrims wound through alleys patrolled by mailed knights. Faith and force coexisted uneasily, each dependent on the other. For the survival of the Latin kingdom, both would be needed. Among those who witnessed this fragile balance was Hugh of Payens, a veteran of the First Crusade. Like many knights of his generation, he had seen the triumphs and horrors of holy war firsthand. He understood the fervor that had driven men to Jerusalem and the emptiness that followed when victory gave way to uncertainty. Hugh was not a great lord or prince, but a man of conviction. As he watched pilgrims suffer and die along the road to the holy city, the question of Christian knighthood became more than a philosophical puzzle. It became a call to action. The political and military situation of the Crusader states made such an idea seem almost necessary. The Latin rulers lacked the manpower to patrol every road and defend every outpost. The armies of Jerusalem were composed largely of feudal levies, knights who owed service for a limited time and often returned home when their term ended. There was no permanent, disciplined force devoted solely to the defense of pilgrims and the holy sites. For men like Hugh, this was a void that cried out to be filled. At the same time, the monastic world was evolving. The Benedictine and Cistercian reforms of the 11th and 12th centuries had renewed interest in discipline, labor, and community life. The idea that service to God could take many forms, manual work, charity, or scholarship, was widely accepted. Extending that principle to armed defense was radical, but not impossible. The conditions of the Holy Land seemed to demand it. The combination of these forces, spiritual crisis, military necessity, and the constant peril faced by pilgrims, created the perfect environment for innovation. In the West, the Church continued to preach that knights must channel their strength toward righteous causes. In the East, knights like Hugh sought to embody that preaching through action. It was not enough to fight wars. They wanted to make warfare itself a form of devotion, a holy vocation. And so, out of the dust of the First Crusade and the dangers of the Pilgrim roads, a new vision of Christian service began to form. It was a vision in which the knight's sword and the monk's prayer were no longer at odds, but partners in the same divine struggle. This concept, the warrior of God, would soon find its first true expression in the men who gathered around Hugh of Payens. The world after the First Crusade was a world searching for stability. The victory of 1099 had opened a door between heaven and earth, but that door stood on uncertain hinges. The Latin kingdoms were under constant threat, the pilgrim routes were soaked in danger, and the spiritual identity of the Christian knight was unresolved. Out of that uncertainty came the seeds of transformation. Hugh of Payens and his companions would take the contradictions of their time, the tension between faith and war, between prayer and action, and forge from them something entirely new. They would give form to the unspoken ideal of their age, the monk who fights, the warrior who prays. In the years to come, that idea would shape not only the destiny of the Crusader states, but the imagination of Christendom itself. For now, the stage was set. The Holy Land awaited its defenders. The roads to Jerusalem cried out for guardians, and in the heart of one French knight, the vision of a sacred brotherhood began to burn. Hugh of Payens emerged from the quiet hills of Champagne in northeastern France, a region known in the 12th century for its vineyards, its fairs, and its deeply rooted feudal loyalties. Born into the lesser nobility sometime around 1070, Hugh belonged to that class of men whose lives were shaped by service to their lords, to their lands, and increasingly to their faith. The world of his youth was the world that produced the First Crusade, an age of restless nights, torn between the demands of warfare and the longing for salvation. For men like Hugh, the Crusade offered an answer to both. He joined the great movement eastward, likely in the company of Count Hugh of Champagne, his liege lord and one of the earliest supporters of the crusading cause. When the armies of Christendom captured Jerusalem in 1099, Hugh of Payens was among the survivors of a campaign that had consumed thousands. The victory left an indelible mark on him. He had seen the holy places restored to Christian rule, but he had also witnessed the cost, the hunger, the brutal sieges, the death of comrades. Returning to France was possible, as it was for most crusaders, but something kept him in the East. Perhaps it was duty, perhaps conviction, or perhaps an awareness that conquest was only the beginning of a far greater task. The holy city might have been reclaimed, but its safety, and that of the pilgrims who came after, was far from assured. Little survives in the record about Hugh's early years after the First Crusade, yet the fragments that do remain suggest a man of steady purpose rather than sudden inspiration. Later chroniclers described him as devout, disciplined, and thoughtful, a soldier tempered by experience rather than driven by ambition. He was not a preacher or a noble prince. He was a knight who understood the routines of command, the discipline of obedience, and the loneliness of service far from home. In an age when glory was often measured by titles and lands, Hugh's significance lay in ideas. He envisioned a way for the martial calling of knighthood to be reconciled with the spiritual ideals of monastic life. By the second decade of the 12th century, Hugh had gathered around him a small group of like-minded companions. Among them was Godfrey de Saint-Amour, a fellow French knight whose name appears beside Hugh's in the earliest charters of the order. Another was André de Montbard, uncle to the influential Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, who would later become the Templars' most powerful advocate. The other names have faded into obscurity, but the tradition preserved their number 9 knights in all, men bound by vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and by a single mission, to protect the pilgrims traveling through the dangerous passes between the port of Jaffa and the holy sites of Jerusalem. Their beginning was humble almost to the point of invisibility. They possessed no lands, no treasury, and no recognized rule. The Latin kingdom itself was still struggling for stability. The king, Baldwin II, ruled from a city that remained half in ruins. Yet the problem the new brotherhood set out to address was both urgent and visible to all. Pilgrims continued to pour into the Holy Land, and the roads they followed were littered with the evidence of danger: burned wagons, abandoned relics, and the bones of the dead. A small, disciplined band of knights willing to patrol those routes could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of travelers. That was the task Hugh accepted. The king granted the group quarters within a section of the royal palace on the Temple Mount, believed to stand upon the ruins of Solomon's Temple. From this location their later name would arise, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, in Latin, Milites Templi Salomonis, or simply Templars. At this early stage, however, they were known only for their poverty. Contemporary sources emphasize that they owned no splendid horses, no gold ornaments, no fine armor. Their clothing was simple, their weapons functional. They lived much like monks, following fixed hours of prayer and fasting, sleeping in shared quarters, and eating at a common table. The only difference lay in the nature of their work. Their service to God was performed with sword and shield. Hugh's leadership appears to have been marked by calm persistence rather than charisma. He lacked the commanding presence of a noble crusader prince, but he possessed something perhaps more valuable: credibility. He was a veteran who had seen battle, a knight who lived the virtues he preached, and a man trusted by both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Over time, his tiny company earned a reputation for reliability. Pilgrims reported that the roads near Jerusalem were safer when the poor knights of the temple were abroad. Their numbers remained small, but their example began to attract notice. For the knights themselves, daily life was austere. They rose before dawn to pray, trained in arms through the heat of the day, and rode escort for groups of travelers whenever required. At night they kept watch, sometimes sleeping in armor. They were bound to each other by vows as strict as any cloistered order in the West. They owned nothing individually. Even their horses were considered communal property. When not on patrol, they tended their gear, copied passages of Scripture, or assisted the canons of the Holy Sepulchre in tending to pilgrims. Such simplicity was deliberate. It reflected Hugh's conviction that discipline and humility were the true marks of a soldier of Christ. The symbolism of their life on the Temple Mount did not go unnoticed. The place was charged with biblical meaning, and the idea that a new order of Christian knights guarded the ancient temple carried powerful resonance throughout Christendom. Visitors from Europe spread word of the small brotherhood who lived among the ruins and devoted themselves to the protection of the faithful. One chronicler described them as monks of the battlefield, men who combined the prayers of the cloister with the courage of crusaders. For many in the West, weary of corruption among both soldiers and clergy, the image was profoundly inspiring. The early years tested their endurance. They had no formal recognition from the church and relied on alms and the king's generosity for survival. But Hugh's quiet vision began to find sympathetic ears among the clergy in Jerusalem, particularly among the patriarch and the community of the Holy Sepulchre. Their approval gave the group legitimacy, if not yet authority. Gradually, the idea of a military monastic order took shape, something entirely new in Christian history. It was an innovation born of necessity, but it resonated with deeper theological currents already moving through the medieval world. By around 1120, the existence of Hugh's brotherhood was known across the Latin East. 9 knights riding under no banner of gold or heraldic device, their shields plain, their garments unadorned, had become a familiar sight on the pilgrim roads. Their courage combined with their humility made an impression far greater than their numbers. To the pilgrims they protected, they were guardians of God's city. To the church, they represented a daring synthesis of two callings long kept apart. To Hugh himself, they were the embodiment of a simple conviction that faith was not only to be contemplated but also defended. In later centuries, legend would enlarge these beginnings into myth, surrounding Hugh of Payens with secrets and hidden purposes. The historical record, however, presents a more human figure, a French knight of modest origin whose strength lay in clarity of purpose and steadfast discipline. He saw the suffering of the pilgrims and the weakness of the Latin states and proposed a solution grounded in both practicality and devotion. From 9 poor knights living within the ancient Temple Mount would grow an institution that would stretch from Jerusalem to the shores of the Atlantic. For now, in those early years, they remain what their name proclaimed, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. No wealth, no emblem, no armor of gold, only faith, brotherhood, and duty. Under Hugh of Payens, that was enough to begin the long journey from obscurity to legend. In the quiet halls of Jerusalem's temple precinct, sometime in the early 12th century, a letter was written. It was brief, humble, and signed simply, Hugh, a sinner. But within its few lines lay an idea that would reshape the spiritual and military life of the Middle Ages. It was a letter addressed to the brothers of the temple, the small band of knights who had taken vows beside him, and it offered not only encouragement, but a philosophy, a justification for what they were doing and why it mattered before God. To understand Hugh of Payens' words, we must understand the world he lived in. Monks in the West had long been guided by the rule of Saint Benedict, a doctrine of contemplation and withdrawal. The holiest men were those who renounced the world, who fled its noise, its pleasures, and its wars. They prayed, fasted, copied scripture, and tended their gardens behind stone walls. Theirs was a life of silence and stillness, the opposite of the battlefield. To the medieval mind, prayer and bloodshed could not coexist. Holiness belonged in the cloister, violence to the world outside it. But Hugh of Payens had seen another truth. He had walked through Jerusalem after the First Crusade, where victory had left behind ruins and uncertainty. He had seen pilgrims cut down by bandits, monks assaulted on their way to pray, and the holy city itself defended by soldiers too few to hold it. He understood that faith alone could not survive without protection. And so, in his letter, Hugh offered a radical reinterpretation of what it meant to serve God. He began, as many medieval writers did, by calling himself a sinner, a gesture of humility. But his tone quickly became firm, almost defiant. He addressed the criticisms that had already begun to circulate among churchmen. It is not fitting, they said, for men who call themselves religious to ride into battle. How can monks, sworn to peace, spill blood with their swords? Hugh's answer was simple, but profound. He wrote, if you were supposed to seek rest and quiet, there would be no religious orders left in God's church. In those few words, he rejected centuries of monastic tradition. For Hugh, idleness was not holiness. Prayer was necessary, but so too was action. A monk who refused to work, who retreated from the needs of the world, betrayed the very order of creation. Even the desert hermits, he reminded his brothers, had to labor for food, clothing, and the necessities of life. If no one plows and sows, who will feed those who pray? That simple image, the plowman and the monk, became the foundation of his thought. Hugh saw all Christian labor as part of one divine economy. The farmer who tilled the soil, the craftsman who forged tools, the soldier who defended the city, all shared a role in sustaining God's kingdom on earth. Contemplation alone could not preserve Christendom. It needed those willing to act, to build, and when necessary, to fight. In Hugh's mind, the Christian knight was not a contradiction. He was the necessary counterpart to the monk, the other half of God's design. This was the birth of what later theologians would call active spirituality. It was the idea that faith was not meant to withdraw from the world but to engage with it, that the body, the sword, and the plow were instruments of divine service just as surely as the pen and the prayer book. The Templars would live this philosophy more visibly than any order before them. Their daily rhythm joined the liturgy of monks to the discipline of soldiers. They prayed at dawn and rode into battle by noon. Their swords were consecrated by purpose, the defense of pilgrims, the preservation of the Holy Land, the survival of Christian civilization itself. Hugh's letter, though practical in tone, was a theological revolution. It did not glorify violence. It sanctified duty. He reminded his brothers that their strength was not for conquest or revenge, but for the protection of the weak and the innocent. They were to live without pride, obey their commanders, and fight not for plunder, but for love of Christ. Their courage, their discipline, even their willingness to die were forms of prayer. As later chroniclers would write, they carried the cross on their cloaks and Christ in their hearts. Hugh's philosophy echoed the heroic literature of his age, stories that were sung in castles and marketplaces across France. In the Chanson de Roland, the archbishop who rode with Charlemagne's army looked upon the dying hero and cried, "You do well, Roland. A knight who bears arms and sits a horse ought to act like this. He should be fierce and strong in battle, otherwise he is worth nothing, and should be a monk praying for our sins." This line, often quoted by scholars like Helen Nicholson, captures the same spirit as Hugh's letter. It was not enough to pray for righteousness, one must defend it. Roland's sword, like Hugh's, was an instrument of faith. Another poem of the same age, Le Guillaume d'Orange, told of a weary warrior who sought redemption by becoming a monk. When his abbot forbade him to defend himself from bandits, the knight protested. "Such a rule is too harsh. The order of knighthood is more worthwhile. They fight against the pagans. They allow themselves to be martyred for the love of God. They are baptized in their own blood." In this imagined exchange, the medieval poet gave voice to a growing belief across Latin Christendom that the knight who fought justly, who risked his life for others, was as holy as the monk who prayed. Hugh of Payens embodied that ideal not in verse, but in life. He took the chivalric code with its talk of honor and courage and wove it into a theology of divine service. For him, the battlefield could be a cloister. The act of defending the helpless could be an offering to God. The knight's sword, purified by discipline and humility, could become a form of prayer. This was the foundation of the Templar worldview, a synthesis of feudal duty and monastic devotion. In later decades, theologians would give this idea a name, Militia Christi, the soldiers of Christ. It was a phrase that captured the essence of Hugh's vision. No longer was the warrior an outsider to salvation. He was now a servant of God's order, a guardian of the faithful. In the Templar oath, the knight swore to defend Christ's tomb and protect pilgrims by the grace of God and the edge of the sword. The distinction between the monk and the knight began to blur. Both were bound by vows, both sought purity, both lived under obedience. But where the monk waged war against sin within his soul, the Templar fought against evil in the world beyond the monastery walls. This union of contemplation and combat was something entirely new in Christian history. It would have profound consequences. For centuries to come, rulers and popes would call their warriors soldiers of Christ. The notion of the holy war would be recast, not as a contradiction, but as a form of devotion. The Templars' black and white banner, the Bosint, symbolized this balance, black for penance, white for purity. Their lives were a constant tension between the sword and the prayer book, between the camp and the chapel. Hugh's philosophy gave meaning to that tension. He told his brothers that their labor, their hardships, their very blood were offerings acceptable to God. Their discipline and sacrifice were acts of worship as real as any mass. This conviction sustained them through centuries of conflict. They did not fight for wealth, for territory, or for fame, at least in their ideal form. They fought because they believed that by protecting Christ's people, they were serving Christ himself. To later generations, the letter of Hugh of Payens became a kind of spiritual charter. It was less a set of rules than a declaration of purpose, a manifesto of faith and action. It justified the existence of the Templars, not as mere warriors, but as guardians of civilization. It redefined holiness not as retreat from the world, but as engagement with it. In Hugh's mind, a knight who prayed was good, but a knight who prayed and defended was better. Thus, from the heart of the holy city, amidst the ruins of Solomon's temple, a new theology was born. One that sanctified the labor of the sword and declared that fighting, when done for the right cause, could itself be an act of love. The Templars called it service. Hugh called it obedience. History would remember it as the creation of the Militia Christi, the soldiers of Christ, the men who turned warfare into worship, and in doing so, forever changed the meaning of faith in arms. By the 1120s, the Brotherhood of the Temple had become a familiar sight in the streets of Jerusalem. Their white mantles were still plain, without the red cross that would later define them. They patrolled the roads, guarded caravans, escorted pilgrims, and slept among the ruins of Solomon's temple. But even as their deeds earned admiration from travelers, a cloud of uncertainty hung over them. The church, whose blessing they needed above all else, was divided. For many clerics in both East and West, the very idea of a military order seemed dangerously contradictory. How could monks, vowed to poverty and peace, wield swords and spill blood? To some observers, the Templars were an unsettling experiment. They wore the garb of monks, but lived by the sword. Their hands, consecrated to prayer, were also instruments of death. To the theologians of Europe, this raised questions that struck at the very heart of Christian ethics. For a millennium, the Church had preached that violence was the work of sin, that a man who killed, even in defense, risked his soul. Even soldiers returning from crusade were told to confess their acts of war and seek absolution. Now, a small order of knights claimed that battle itself could be holy. Many churchmen called this heresy in all but name. In monasteries and councils, their critics spoke openly. One abbot, in a letter preserved from the period, wrote bitterly, "They ride in arms and call themselves monks. Can Christ bless the hand that kills, even if it kills for him?" Others accuse them of pride, of pretending to sanctity while living like warriors. Rumors spread that they sought to escape discipline, inventing a rule to excuse their own ambitions. Some even mocked their poverty, suggesting that their claim to own nothing was a disguise for future power. In a world where spiritual legitimacy depended on hierarchy and approval, the Templars' independence seemed dangerous. Hugh of Payens heard these voices. And true to his nature, he did not respond with anger, but with reason. His surviving letter to the Brothers of the Temple, already bold in its defense of active faith, was only one part of his greater argument. He began corresponding with churchmen across the Latin East, including the Patriarch of Jerusalem and leading abbots in France. His purpose was clear: to explain that the Templars were not breaking the laws of God, but fulfilling them in a new way. He reminded them that even in Scripture, men of faith had taken up arms when duty demanded it. That King David, though forbidden to build the temple, had fought to defend his people. That St. Peter had carried a sword in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that Christ himself had said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Hugh's letters and sermons framed the Templars' calling as one of sacrifice, not conquest. They were not knights seeking glory, he argued, but penitents seeking redemption through service. Each battle they fought, each wound they suffered, was an act of devotion, a prayer written not in ink, but in blood and courage. They fought not to destroy, but to defend. And unlike mercenaries or feudal soldiers, they took no pay, held no lands, and obeyed no lord but Christ. In this light, Hugh declared, their swords were not weapons of ambition, but tools of divine justice. In his own words, "We are poor, yet we hold the riches of faith. We shed blood, yet it is in defense of the innocent. We ride not for glory, but for the cross." Gradually, his reasoning began to reach sympathetic ears. Among the rising stars of the Cistercian reform movement, a new generation of monks calling for purity and discipline within the Church, there were some who understood Hugh's purpose. They saw in the Templars a reflection of their own struggle, a desire to renew Christian life through austerity, devotion, and work. Foremost among them was Bernard of Clairvaux, a man whose influence would come to define the spiritual identity of the 12th century. At this time, Bernard was already a towering figure. Born of noble blood, trained in monastic austerity, he had become abbot of Clairvaux and a leading voice of the Cistercian order. His sermons moved kings, his letters shaped papal policy, and his reputation for holiness was unmatched. Bernard believed passionately that every act of life could serve God, provided it was guided by humility and love. When Hugh of Payens and his companions came to seek his counsel, Bernard recognized in them not heretics, but innovators. He saw the potential of their order to embody a new kind of spirituality, one that united the discipline of the cloister with the courage of the battlefield. Yet even Bernard was cautious at first. He understood the danger of blurring the line between piety and violence. He questioned Hugh closely about the order's practices, their vows, their prayers, their obedience. What rule did they follow? What protection did they offer to the poor? Did they fight for vengeance or for love? Hugh's answers impressed him. The Templars, he learned, lived under strict discipline. They rose at set hours, ate in silence, confessed their sins weekly, and shared all possessions in common. They took no prisoners for ransom and accepted no spoils of war. Every man among them was bound by oath to defend the helpless, to protect widows and orphans, and to respect the Church above all earthly power. To Bernard, this sounded less like hypocrisy and more like a miracle. Here was an order that sought to redeem the warrior's life through purity of purpose. Here were men who turned the sword, once an emblem of sin, into an instrument of mercy. He wrote later that they seek no victory save that of Christ, no crown but that of martyrdom. This idea that a knight could become holy through disciplined combat was revolutionary. It offered redemption to an entire class of men who had long been condemned for their calling. For the first time, the Church could tell its warriors, "You may fight and still be saved." Still, the opposition did not vanish. Many senior clerics in Europe continued to resist. They feared the precedent that others might form their own holy militias and challenge papal authority. Some accused the Templars of arrogance, claiming they sought to rival the monasteries in holiness while enjoying worldly fame. Even in Jerusalem, tensions arose between the Templars and other religious communities, particularly the canons of the Holy Sepulchre, who resented the Knights' growing prestige. The Latin kingdom was small, fragile, and filled with competing orders. The appearance of this new brotherhood upset the delicate balance of power. But Hugh remained patient. He did not seek confrontation. He sought recognition. And to achieve it, he knew he would need more than letters. He would need the support of someone whose authority was beyond question. That figure was Bernard of Clairvaux. In the years that followed, the two men formed a partnership that would alter the fate of the Templars forever. Bernard became their advocate before the highest authorities of the Church. He defended them in his writings, most famously in his treatise De Laude Novi Militia, in praise of the new knighthood, a work that transformed public opinion. But at this stage, in the 1120s, that defense was still taking shape. For Hugh and his companions, life continued as before: long hours of patrol, sparse meals, prayers by candlelight. Their fame grew slowly, by reputation more than proclamation. Pilgrims told stories of the knights who asked for no payment, who risked their lives for strangers, who lived as simply as monks. And little by little, those stories reached the courts of Europe. By the end of the decade, the tide had begun to turn. What had started as whispers of doubt became murmurs of admiration. Theologians who once condemned them now debated their role with curiosity. Some even suggested that perhaps God had called forth this order for a new age of Christendom, an age when the sword and the cross would no longer be enemies, but allies. In that slow transformation of hearts and minds, the patient hand of Hugh of Payens can still be felt. He never shouted, never demanded, never rebelled. He reasoned, he wrote, and he waited, certain that truth would reveal itself in time. By the time he returned to Europe to present his case before the Council of Troyes, he had already won the most important battle of his life, the battle for legitimacy. The world was beginning to see what he had always believed: that holiness was not confined to stone walls, that faith could ride on horseback, and that a knight who shed his blood for the innocent could be as pure before God as any monk at prayer. Winter, 1129. The French city of Troyes lay under a veil of frost. Its narrow streets echoed with the murmurs of travelers and the slow tolling of church bells. Inside the cathedral's chapter hall, candles flickered against cold stone walls. Bishops, abbots, and envoys of the church gathered around a long wooden table. Before them stood a quiet, unassuming knight, a man of few words but great purpose, Hugh of Payens, master of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. This was no ordinary meeting. The fate of Hugh's brotherhood hung in the balance. For more than a decade, he and his companions had lived and fought in the Holy Land, poor, disciplined, devoted. They had patrolled the roads from Jaffa to Jerusalem, guarding pilgrims and dying in anonymity. They had been admired by some, doubted by others, and ignored by many. Now, at last, the question would be settled. Could the Church truly accept an order of warrior monks, men who prayed like monks but killed like knights, as a legitimate arm of Christendom? The Council of Troyes, convened by Pope Honorius II, presided over by the Archbishop of Reims, brought together the most powerful churchmen in France. Among them sat a figure whose presence carried more weight than any papal legate or noble abbot, Bernard of Clairvaux. The Cistercian reformer was already a legend in his own time, austere, eloquent, and filled with quiet fire. He had come to speak for the Templars, at the request of Hugh himself. As the council opened, the assembled clergy examined the case. Reports of the Templars' deeds had reached Europe: their courage on the pilgrim roads, their strict poverty, their refusal of personal wealth, yet doubt lingered. Could a man serve God with a sword in his hand? Could the spilling of blood ever be sanctified by prayer? Some bishops still called them a paradox, others a danger. They feared what might happen if war were given the blessing of the Church. Would every knight then claim his battles were holy? Hugh of Payens stood before them in silence. He was no fiery orator. His strength lay in calm conviction. He had crossed the sea from the Holy Land to answer these questions face to face, to defend not himself, but the very idea of his order. He spoke plainly of their mission, to protect pilgrims, to guard the Holy Sepulchre, to live as poor men bound by vows. His voice, witnesses said, was low and deliberate, his words without ornament. He described their daily discipline, prayer, fasting, obedience, the renunciation of all personal property. He spoke of brothers buried along the road to Jerusalem, cut down while escorting travelers. And finally he said what few knights had ever said in a council of the Church. We fight not for conquest, but for salvation, ours and others alike. The sword we bear is not for glory, but for defense of the faith. The hall fell silent. Then Bernard of Clairvaux rose. Where Hugh was measured and restrained, Bernard was radiant with conviction. He had studied the Templars' way of life, corresponded with Hugh, and found in them the living embodiment of his own belief that holiness could exist beyond the cloister. His voice, shaped by years of preaching, filled the hall. He declared that the Knights of the Temple were not ordinary soldiers, but Milites Christi, the soldiers of Christ. Their calling, he said, was born of love, not hatred. They fought not to destroy souls, but to save them. Their discipline was greater than that of most monks. Their purity, tested by battle, was proof of divine favor. Behold, he said, a new kind of knighthood has appeared upon the earth. It fights a double war, against flesh and blood, and against the spirit of evil itself. In the body it conquers enemies of Christ. In the soul it conquers sin. Those words, recorded later in Bernard's famous treatise De Laude Novi Militia, in praise of the new knighthood, turned the tide. His eloquence gave theological legitimacy to what had once seemed impossible. If the Church could bless the plowman for feeding the poor, why not the soldier who protected them? If the monk's labor was prayer, why not the knight's battle when fought in love and faith? Bernard's argument transformed the Templars' paradox into a divine necessity. They were not breaking the rules of monastic life. They were extending them into the world. The council debated for days. Witnesses described long sessions of testimony, letters read aloud from Jerusalem, and consultations of Scripture. Hugh answered questions about their vows, their obedience, and their conduct in war. Every detail was examined: how they prayed, how they ate, what they owned, and what punishments they imposed for disobedience. The bishops demanded that their rule be written down, not improvised or symbolic, but codified according to canon law. And so, under Bernard's guidance, a document began to take shape, the Latin Rule of the Templars. Modeled loosely on the rule of Saint Benedict, it adapted monastic discipline to the life of a warrior. Its preamble declared that the Templars were servants of Christ, established for the defense of the Holy Sepulchre. It bound them to the three great vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience, and added a fourth: to fight for the faith. They were to live communally, eat modestly, and wear simple clothing. They were forbidden to hunt, to gamble, to swear, or to accept gifts. They were to attend daily Mass, confess often, and remember always that the life of a Templar was one of sacrifice. No gold, no silver, no soft garments, only the sword, the cross, and the call of duty. The rule also defined their humility. A Templar was never to boast of his deeds, never to retreat from battle unless outnumbered 3-1, and never to strike a foe out of anger. He was to ride into combat with discipline and silence, seeing himself as the hand of divine justice, not as an instrument of vengeance. The text made clear that their war was not against men, but against evil itself. The Templar, it said, does not kill for joy, but for Christ. When the final draft was read aloud, those gathered at Troyes understood that something unprecedented had occurred. The Church had not merely permitted the Templars to exist, it had embraced them. For the first time in Christian history, a monastic order had been given the right and the duty to fight. The paradox was resolved. The sword and the cross could now belong to the same hand. The approval of the council gave the Templars legal standing within Christendom and papal protection against secular interference. They were now a recognized religious order, answerable only to the Pope. At that moment, according to later tradition, the Templars adopted their new symbol, the red cross upon a white mantle. The white represented their purity of life, the red, their willingness to shed blood in service to Christ. It was not a badge of conquest, but of sacrifice. To wear it was to accept the possibility of martyrdom, to die in the field as surely as a monk might die in his cell. It was a sign that they belonged not to any kingdom or lord, but to God alone. For Hugh of Payens, the decision of the Council of Troyes marked the culmination of 2 decades of perseverance. He had fought for this recognition not with armies, but with faith and patience. He had endured mockery, doubt, and endless scrutiny. Now, in that cold French hall, the Church had spoken, and in doing so it had consecrated his vision. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ were no longer a humble band of outcasts. They were now an order, legitimate, protected, and eternal in purpose. Witnesses say that when the council adjourned, Hugh knelt before Bernard of Clairvaux and thanked him for his defense. Bernard lifted him to his feet, saying simply, "It is not I who defend you, but he who called you." There was no triumphal procession, no grand ceremony, only a quiet sense of destiny fulfilled. Hugh returned to the Holy Land soon after, carrying the Latin rule with him, to be read aloud to his brothers on the Temple Mount. For them it was more than law. It was Scripture. It was the moment their calling became immortal. From that winter's council, the order of the Temple spread across Christendom. Noble families sent their sons to join it, kings granted it lands, and pilgrims spoke its name with reverence. The Red Cross became a symbol known from Jerusalem to the coasts of France. And in every chapter house, every fortress, every chapel where the Templars gathered, the words of that first approval were remembered. That a man could fight for God and still keep his soul. It was the Church's final answer to a question that had haunted Christendom for centuries. Can faith and the sword coexist? In the winter of 1129, in the city of Troyes, the answer was written in ink and sealed with the cross. In the decades following the Council of Troyes, the Order of the Temple began to take shape, not merely as a military force, but as a disciplined brotherhood unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen. Its members were called paupers Camilitones Christi Templici Salomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. To outsiders, they were warriors cloaked in white. To those within, they were monks in armor, bound by rules as strict as any abbey. Their life was one of obedience, simplicity, and unrelenting devotion, a fusion of prayer and war, humility and courage. An early Templar's day began before dawn. In the darkness of their dormitory, as the first faint light touched the walls of their fortress, the sound of the chapel bell summoned them from sleep. They rose in silence, pulled on their coarse woolen habits, and moved toward the chapel in orderly lines. Here, beneath flickering lamps, they began their day with the chanting of the divine office, the same prayers spoken by monks across Europe. Voices echoed through stone halls, psalms, hymns, and readings from Scripture offered before the day's labors began. There were no servants, no comforts. Each brother cleaned his own armor, cared for his horse, and mended his cloak. The order's rule allowed no vanity. Their clothes were plain, their meals modest, their quarters sparse. They owned nothing but what the order granted, a sword, a cloak, and a place in the brotherhood. The rule of the temple dictated every aspect of their existence. It prescribed when they would eat, when they would fast, when they would speak, and when they would remain silent. During meals, conversation was forbidden. A single brother read aloud from the Scriptures or the writings of the saints while the others ate in contemplation. They sat at long wooden tables, bowls of bread and lentils before them, and listened to words meant to nourish the soul as much as the body. The silence was part of their discipline, a way to tame pride and train the mind for obedience. Their diet was austere. Meat was permitted only a few times a week. On other days, they ate vegetables, beans, and black bread. Wine was allowed but diluted with water, lest indulgence dull the senses. The rule forbade them to hunt, to play games, or to gamble. They were not to boast, to swear, or to jest idly. Every action was measured, every moment weighed against the standard of service to God. The Templar ideal was not heroic in the worldly sense. It was penitential, an act of living martyrdom. When not engaged in prayer or duty, the brothers trained. Their discipline in arms was as rigorous as their devotion in chapel. Sword drills, mounted combat, and endurance exercises filled the hours between prayers. They practiced formation riding, lance work, and hand-to-hand combat, often in silence, learning to fight as one body guided by a single will. To the Templars, combat was not a display of strength, but an offering, a test of faith under fire. They trained not to conquer, but to endure. Their greatest weapon was unity. No knight fought alone. Unlike the nobles of Europe, the Templars disdained luxury. Their cloaks were white, symbolizing purity, but often worn and stained from travel. Their armor was plain iron, without decoration. They shared horses, 2 men to 1 animal, unless battle demanded otherwise. They rode with few possessions, often carrying little more than a rosary and a sword. In an age where knights displayed wealth as proof of status, the Templars turned poverty into honor. The rule warned against superfluous adornment, commanding that their clothing be humble and uniform. Even their belts and scabbards were stripped of ornament. The only mark that distinguished them was the red cross sewn upon their mantles, a sign of their willingness to bleed for Christ. Their vow of poverty was absolute. No brother could own money or land. Even gifts received in gratitude were handed over to the order. The vow of chastity demanded purity of body and thought. Women were forbidden from their houses, and no Templar could kiss even his mother or sister without permission. Their vow of obedience bound them to their Grand Master and to the rule unquestioning and complete. A Templar's will was not his own. His life was the property of God. Disobedience was among the gravest sins, punished by penance or expulsion. Yet beneath this stern discipline ran a profound sense of brotherhood. Each Templar addressed the other as Froder, brother, regardless of rank or origin. The knight of noble birth shared his meals with the sergeant of humble birth. They slept side by side in the same dormitories, ate from the same bowls, rode in the same ranks. Their equality within the order was radical for its time. What mattered was not lineage or wealth, but devotion and courage. They were bound together by a single purpose, to serve Christ through service to one another. The rules stated all things should be held in common, as it is written, and none should say that anything he possesses is his own. Before every battle, the Templars prepared themselves not with feasting, but with prayer. They confessed their sins to the chaplain, received absolution, and knelt together before the crucifix. The chapel bells would sound, and the brothers would march out in silence, their banners fluttering in the desert wind. They did not sing war songs or shout oaths. Their calmness was their courage. It was said that a Templar rode into battle without fear of death, for he believed that dying in defense of the faith was not defeat, but victory. One chronicler wrote, "They go forth as if already dead, for they know that in death they will live." The contrast between the Templars and the worldly knights of Europe could not have been sharper. A noble knight fought for honor, wealth, or fame, his armor gilded, his banner emblazoned with his family crest. He might fight bravely, but his purpose was often personal. The Templar, by contrast, renounced his name, his wealth, even his family. He carried no heraldry, but the red cross of the order. Where worldly knights sought glory, the Templars sought grace. Where others boasted of their conquests, the Templars spoke only of God's will. Their victories were not celebrated with feasts, but with prayer and fasting. In this humility lay their strength, the spiritual steel that made them feared and respected across Christendom and beyond. Inside the walls of their fortresses, from Jerusalem to Acre, from Antioch to the castles of France, the Templars lived in a rhythm as precise as the tolling of bells. Every hour had its purpose. At dawn, prayer; at midday, labor; at sunset, reflection. At night they slept fully clothed, ready to rise at the sound of an alarm. Their fortresses were not places of comfort, but of vigilance. Each man knew that peace was fragile, that the enemy could strike at any moment. Discipline was not merely spiritual, it was survival. Yet even in that constant readiness, their spiritual life flourished. They were not merely soldiers, but contemplatives in armor. The Templar rule required frequent confession, daily attendance at Mass, and continual remembrance of the divine. Scripture was recited aloud at meals, and chaplains traveled with them into battlefields and deserts alike. They were told to remember always that the war they fought was inward as much as outward, the battle against pride, fear, and sin. To die without repentance was to fall as any sinner might. To die in a state of grace was to ascend as a martyr. This belief shaped every action, every breath. It gave them a serenity that mystified their enemies and inspired their allies. They fought fiercely, but without hatred. They endured hardship without complaint. Their lives were a continual offering, a balance of prayer and warfare that redefined what holiness could mean in an age of violence. In them, the Church saw the living answer to the question once asked in disbelief. Can a warrior be holy? Can war serve God? The early Templars believed the answer was yes, not through conquest, but through discipline, not through domination, but through devotion. Their poverty was their strength, their unity their shield, their silence their prayer, and their red cross, a constant reminder that even on the battlefield, faith must be their master, not fury. As the years passed, the order's fame spread. Pilgrims whispered of their courage. Kings marveled at their humility. And throughout Christendom, the image of the silent knight in a white cloak with a red cross became the symbol of purity through sacrifice, the embodiment of the militia Christi, the soldiers of Christ. For these men, every dawn was a calling, every battle a prayer, every death a form of salvation. They had turned the ideals of the cloister into the discipline of the field. They were monks who fought, soldiers who prayed, and in their unity of faith and arms, they forged a new ideal for all of Christendom. The warrior of God, the guardian of the pilgrim, the servant of the divine. In the years following the Council of Troyes, the newly recognized Order of the Temple transformed from a small, obscure brotherhood into one of the most disciplined and admired institutions of the medieval world. Yet the early decades were still years of uncertainty and constant struggle. The Holy Land, known to the Crusaders as Outremer, the land beyond the sea, was fragile. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem stood surrounded by powerful Muslim states and fractured by internal rivalries. Its survival depended not only on faith, but on vigilance. For Hugh of Payens and his brothers, this was the proving ground of their calling. Their creed would be tested not in monasteries or councils, but on the dust-choked roads and sunburnt plains of Palestine. The first Templars had been formed for a single purpose, to protect the pilgrims who braved the dangerous routes between Jaffa, the coastal port, and Jerusalem, the sacred heart of Christendom. This road, winding through valleys and barren hills, was notorious for ambushes. Bands of raiders, remnants of defeated armies, desert tribes, or opportunistic bandits preyed on the caravans of pilgrims. For many years after the First Crusade, travelers spoke of entire groups vanishing in the wilderness, their bones later found along the paths. To guard these pilgrims was not only a military duty, but a spiritual one. To Hugh and his companions, every rescued pilgrim was a victory for God's mercy, every fallen brother a martyr in his service. At first, their patrols were small, a handful of mounted knights riding in formation, escorting groups of travelers to and from the city. But their courage quickly became legend. Chroniclers record that the temple knights feared neither the arrow nor the sword, and their presence began to restore confidence among Christian settlers. Their strict discipline set them apart from the mercenary bands that often plagued the Crusader states. While others fought for pay or plunder, the Templars fought for faith. They refused spoils, shared their rations with the poor, and buried the dead, friend and foe alike, with equal care. As their reputation grew, so too did their responsibilities. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, recognizing their loyalty and organization, began entrusting them with the defense of key routes and outposts. They became the dependable core of the Latin army, always ready to ride where danger was greatest. When fortresses fell into disrepair, it was the Templars who took up the burden of restoration. Among their earliest posts were the fortresses of Gaza, Torin, and Bagras, strategic points guarding the borders of the Crusader states. These castles were not mere military structures. They were monasteries in stone, each containing a chapel, dormitory, and refectory beside its armory and stables. Within their walls, the line between monk and soldier blurred completely. The Templars' method of warfare was disciplined and precise. They fought not for personal glory, but for the defense of the faith. In battle, they advanced in tight formations, maintaining silence until the ordered charge was given. Their white mantles, marked by the red cross, became symbols of resolve. It was said that they would rather die than retreat, a vow born not of arrogance, but of conviction. For a Templar, death in combat was not defeat, it was the fulfillment of his vows. This reputation for fearlessness spread quickly through both Christian and Muslim lands. Even their enemies respected their discipline. Arab chroniclers described them as men who prefer death to dishonor, who stand unmoved when the world falls about them. During these years, Hugh of Payens himself became more than a commander. He was the architect of the order's identity, its voice to kings and its conscience before God. He understood that faith alone could not sustain the Templars. They needed allies, legitimacy, and resources. So, while many of his brothers remained in the Holy Land, Hugh turned to diplomacy. His leadership extended beyond the battlefield, into the halls of power, across the courts of Europe. By the mid-1120s, Hugh had established close ties with Baldwin II, whose trust in the Templars was unwavering. The king often called upon them to serve as his personal guard during campaigns, and to escort envoys and pilgrims alike. In gratitude for their service, he granted them lands and privileges, strengthening their foothold in the East. Yet even these royal gifts were not enough. The cost of maintaining horses, armor, and fortifications was immense, and the order's vow of poverty forbade its members from owning private wealth. Hugh realized that the survival of the Templars depended on the support of the Church and of the faithful in Europe. In 1127, Hugh embarked on a mission that would shape the future of the order. Leaving a trusted lieutenant to command in Jerusalem, he traveled west, across the Mediterranean and into the courts of Christendom. His goal was clear: to secure formal papal protection, attract new recruits, and inspire the generosity of Christian nobility. It was the first great diplomatic tour of the Templar order. In France, he was received with honor by Count Theobald of Champagne and other noble patrons. At Clairvaux, he met again with Bernard of Clairvaux, whose influence within the Church was unmatched. Bernard had already defended the Templars at Troyes. Now, with Hugh's presence, he began to promote their cause more widely. Together, Hugh and Bernard crafted a vision of the Templars as the ideal expression of Christian knighthood, men who had transformed the sword from a tool of sin into an instrument of divine justice. Bernard's later treatise, De Laude Novi Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood, was written in this period, and its influence was profound. It described the Templars as warriors safe on every side, for their soul is protected by faith as their body is by steel. In this partnership between the humble knight and the eloquent abbot, the spiritual foundation of the order was secured. Hugh's quiet determination and Bernard's fiery words together captured the imagination of Europe. As Hugh journeyed from France to England and beyond, nobles began donating lands, revenues, and equipment to the Templars. Monarchs saw in them a trustworthy ally. Commoners saw a holy cause worth supporting. Templar houses began to appear across Europe, small communities called preceptories or commanderies, each serving as both monastery and logistical base. These establishments provided income, recruits, and supplies for the knights in the East. The Templar network thus began to span the continent, from the Scottish Highlands to the plains of Spain, united by oath and purpose. What had begun as 9 knights in Jerusalem was becoming an international order. Hugh of Payens spent several years in the West, overseeing this expansion. He negotiated with nobles, settled disputes, and ensured that each new preceptory adhered strictly to the rule. He demanded discipline and transparency, forbidding excess and reminding his followers that the Templar's strength lay not in wealth but in purity. He knew well the dangers of success, that fame could lead to pride, and power could corrupt the very ideals they fought to preserve. In letters and testimonies from this time, he is described as calm, persuasive, and deeply devout, a man whose conviction inspired loyalty without coercion. By the time Hugh returned to the Holy Land, around 1129 or 1130, the order had changed beyond recognition. No longer a handful of poor knights, the Templars were now a recognized institution with branches across Europe, papal endorsement, and a growing treasury dedicated entirely to the defense of Christendom. New recruits poured in, young men seeking both adventure and salvation. Many were second sons of noble families, eager to dedicate their lives to a cause greater than inheritance or estate. Each pledged himself to the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and each received the same white mantle marked with the red cross, the symbol that Hugh had carried into battle. Under his leadership, the Templars became a vital arm of the Crusader states. They manned castles, patrolled borders, and served as elite cavalry in key campaigns. Their reliability earned them increasing trust from both kings and popes. They became, in effect, the first truly international military organization, governed not by local lords but by a central command bound to Rome and Jerusalem alike. Their example inspired the creation of other military orders, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, and many lesser brotherhoods that followed in their wake. Hugh's later years were spent between duty and contemplation. He had lived long enough to see his vision realized, a brotherhood of warriors who fought without greed, prayed without ceasing, and served without question. He saw the white mantles ride across the deserts, guarding pilgrims and defending fortresses that he himself had once patrolled. He saw the name of the temple honored in royal courts and whispered in prayers. And though he could not have foreseen the centuries of power and controversy that would follow, he knew that the foundation he had laid was strong. Hugh of Payens died around 1136, likely in the Holy Land, after nearly 2 decades of service as the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar. His grave, like his life, was simple, unadorned, and unmarked by luxury. But his legacy endured. He had taken an idea that faith and duty could unite the sword and the cross, and turned it into an institution that would shape the destiny of both church and empire. Under his leadership, the Templars had become more than soldiers. They had become a symbol of Christian resolve, a bridge between heaven and earth. In the annals of history, Hugh of Payens stands as a quiet revolutionary, not through rebellion, but through conviction. He gave the restless energy of the night a sacred purpose. He proved that discipline could be a form of worship, that courage could be an act of faith, and that the defense of the weak could be the truest service to God. From the roads of Palestine to the courts of Europe, his vision endured, the legacy of a man who believed that holiness could ride in armor. And in the centuries that followed, as the red cross of the temple flew above castles and battlefields across the known world, the spirit of Hugh of Payens lived on, in every brother who took up the sword, not for glory, but for God. The Knights Templar were born in war, but forged in faith. For them, the clash of swords was not a lust for conquest, it was a prayer made in steel. Their battlefield was their cloister, and every charge into the enemy's line was an act of devotion. To understand the soul of the Templar, one must first understand that, in their world, fighting was not the opposite of holiness, it was its expression. Hugh of Payens had built the order on this paradox. He knew that a knight's calling, to bear arms, to protect, to fight, could be either a curse or a blessing. Left ungoverned, it led to vanity, greed, and bloodshed. But when disciplined by faith, it became something sacred. To Hugh, the sword was not a symbol of violence, it was a symbol of purity. It was to be wielded only in defense of the innocent, only at the command of conscience, and only after prayer. He believed that just as monks guarded the soul of the church, the Templars guarded its body, the living pilgrims, the holy places, and the fragile peace of Christendom. This vision was more than practical. It was spiritual transformation. The knight who once fought for his own glory now fought for God's. His armor became his penance, his obedience, his offering. Each Templar vow, poverty, chastity, obedience, mirrored the vows of the monastery, Yet theirs were tested not in silence but amid battle. Where the monk mortified the flesh through fasting, the Templar did so through endurance. Where the monk prayed in solitude, the Templar prayed through courage. Hugh's philosophy found its most eloquent defender in Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot whose voice carried across all of Christendom. Bernard saw in the Templars a divine reconciliation between the sword and the cross, a new kind of sanctity that did not flee from the world but sanctified it through action. In the early 1130s, he wrote a short but powerful treatise titled De Laudi Novi Militia in praise of the new knighthood. It was addressed to Hugh of Payens himself and to the brothers of the Temple. In it, Bernard defined what made them different from all other warriors. A knight of the Temple may strike with confidence and die yet more confidently, for he serves not his own fury, but the justice of God. In another passage, he contrasted the worldly knight, glittering in gold, hungry for fame, with the Templar who fought in humility. They go into battle clothed not in silks, but in faith. Their horses are strong, but their hearts are stronger. They fear neither the demons of flesh nor of spirit. Through Bernard's words, Europe came to see that the Templars were not merely soldiers under a holy banner, they were monks in armor, a new order that made war itself a form of worship. This idea transformed medieval thought. For centuries, the Church had struggled to reconcile the warrior's life with the Gospel's call to peace. Bernard and Hugh together offered an answer. When violence defends the weak and protects the faith, it ceases to be sin, it becomes service. To the Templars, death in battle was not tragedy, it was salvation fulfilled. They entered combat with prayer, their souls prepared for judgment. Before riding out, they confessed, received the Eucharist, and invoked the Virgin Mary. If they fell, they believed their blood washed away their sins. As one chronicler recorded, they fear not the loss of life, for they have already given it to God. In this way, the Templar's sword became a cross. Every swing was a vow renewed, every victory a testament of faith. To them, the battlefield was not chaos, but a kind of sacred order, each knight bound to obedience, each charge dictated by the rule, each retreat forbidden unless commanded. Such discipline made them unstoppable. They did not fight with rage, but with stillness. Their fury was contained within obedience, like a flame kept within the lamp of devotion. In their daily life, the spiritual rhythm of the monastery continued even amid war. They rose before dawn for matins, knelt beside their beds to recite prayers, and kept silence at meals. Their horses were blessed before battle, their weapons polished not with vanity but with reverence. When not fighting, they repaired fortresses, cared for the wounded, and tended the fields that sustained their garrisons. Their discipline was total, for they believed that a distracted knight was a danger to his soul and to his brothers. As their rule declared, let him who bears the sword be as one who bears the cross. The deeper meaning of this union between faith and battle lay in the Templars' understanding of sacrifice. They did not see themselves as conquerors, but as guardians. Their wars were defensive, waged for the preservation of the faith, not its expansion. When they charged into enemy ranks, it was to protect pilgrims, to preserve peace, or to recover ground lost to aggression. This moral clarity gave them a serenity that astonished even their foes. Many Muslim chroniclers who fought against them described their courage as beyond reason, and their calmness in death as the peace of those who see God. To the Templar, obedience was freedom. He had surrendered his will to something greater. He owned nothing, desired nothing, and feared nothing. All that remained was duty, and in duty he found holiness. When he fell, He did so believing that the ground beneath him was sanctified by the purpose for which he fought. As one old prayer of the order declared, "Lord, grant that our fall may be as our rising, in thy service and for thy peace." Hugh of Payens had instilled this spirit from the beginning. He saw that the order could not endure on strength alone. It needed soul. He taught that the truest victory was not survival, but faithfulness. The Templars would rise and fall many times in the centuries to come, but this principle, that fighting could be worship, remained their heart. It gave them discipline when others faltered, and dignity even in defeat. When Bernard wrote of them, he concluded with words that seemed to capture Hugh's vision perfectly. They live in community without property, in humility without shame, in obedience without fear. Their glory is not in victory, but in perseverance. They go out as lambs among wolves, yet the wolves flee. In those lines lies the essence of the Templar spirit, not aggression, but guardianship, not pride, but service, not hatred, but a love fierce enough to fight for what is sacred. And so, in the heart of every Templar, beneath the armor, beyond the battle, burned a single truth: that war, when purified by faith, could become prayer, that courage could be an act of worship, and that the sword held in obedience to God could shine with the same light as the cross. By the mid-1130s, Hugh of Payens had become more than the grand master of a small brotherhood. He was the spiritual architect of an idea that had begun to change the conscience of Christendom. From the dusty roads of Jerusalem to the stone halls of France, the name of the Knights Templar was now spoken with reverence and curiosity alike. In less than 2 decades, Hugh had taken 9 humble knights and turned their faith into a movement, one that would soon stretch across continents. The early years in the Holy Land had been spent in labor and sacrifice, guarding pilgrims, defending castles, and building the reputation of a brotherhood devoted to both sword and spirit. But now, Hugh's mission expanded. He knew that to ensure the order's survival, it needed not only courage but recognition, legitimacy, protection, and the wealth to sustain its vows of poverty. In the early 1130s, Hugh set sail once more for Europe. His journey would mark the closing chapter of his life, but also the beginning of the Templars' ascendance. He arrived first in France, his homeland. The land he had left behind 2 decades earlier was now alive with stories of Jerusalem and the holy warriors who had given their lives there. The call of the Crusades still echoed in the hearts of men. Nobles, bishops, and kings listened as Hugh spoke, not as a warrior pleading for battle, but as a monk speaking of divine purpose. He told them of the brothers who lived without gold, without comfort, who fought not for conquest, but for the defense of the faith. His words carried the gravity of experience and the authority of one who had walked both roads, the knights and the pilgrims. In the courts of Champagne and Burgundy, his message found fertile ground. Many noble families, inspired by his humility, donated land and property to the order. Manors, vineyards, and farms were given to the Templars, not for their own luxury, but to sustain their mission in the East. Each donation was a seed, a commandery, a place where new brothers could train, pray, and prepare for service in the Holy Land. Slowly, a network began to form, from France to England, from Spain to Italy, a web of faith and discipline tied together by a single vow: to serve God through arms. During these years, Hugh also visited the papal court. The church, once cautious about the idea of warrior monks, now looked upon the Templars with growing respect. Thanks in no small part to the influence of Bernard of Clairvaux, who continued to champion their cause, the papacy began to see the Templars as a necessary and holy instrument in the struggle for Christendom's survival. By papal decree, the order was granted independence from local bishops, answerable only to the Pope himself. This protection placed them outside the reach of worldly politics and within the direct guardianship of the Church. It was an extraordinary privilege and a sign that Hugh's vision had triumphed. For the Templars, this meant safety, legitimacy, and freedom. For Hugh, it was vindication, proof that faith, discipline, and sacrifice could transform the most unlikely of ideas into divine approval. The once questioned experiment had now become a cornerstone of Christian Europe. Yet Hugh's life in these final years was not one of rest. He continued to travel between courts and monasteries, meeting lords, abbots, and kings. He sought men of valor and conviction, knights who could lay down their worldly pride and take up the white mantle of purity. He oversaw the establishment of new preceptories, ensuring that the rule of the temple, the strict code of conduct born at the Council of Troyes, was faithfully observed in every corner of Christendom. He was not a man of speeches, but of example. Those who met him described him as calm, devout, and unwavering in purpose. He carried himself with the gravity of one who knew that his time was short, but his work eternal. Around 1136, Hugh of Payens passed away, most likely in France, though the exact details are lost to time. He left no tomb of grandeur, no monument of gold or marble. But his legacy endured in the hearts and deeds of his brothers. By the time of his death, the Knights Templar had grown from a handful of poor warriors into an international order recognized by kings and popes alike. Their banner, the red cross on a white field, had become a symbol of courage, purity, and devotion. It fluttered over fortresses in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli. It marked commanderies in Paris, London, and Aragon. Wherever that cross was seen, it spoke of a faith that could wield the sword without losing the soul. In many ways, Hugh's death symbolized the end of the order's first chapter, the chapter of faith born in struggle, of ideals tested by doubt. He had not lived to see the Templars become the mighty force they would soon become, the bankers of Europe, the builders of castles, the champions of kings. But his design, his simplicity, his devotion, these would remain the order's moral compass for generations. Even as the Templars grew in power and wealth, chroniclers remembered Hugh as the humble knight who began it all, who sought no glory for himself, only for the cause. Centuries later, when the order would fall under suspicion and persecution, when their name would be shrouded in legend and tragedy, those who looked back to their origins would always find Hugh standing at the dawn, pure, untainted, and faithful. He was, in a sense, the conscience of the Templars. His life embodied the balance they always sought: courage without pride, devotion without fanaticism, strength guided by humility. In the closing reflection of his age, one might say that Hugh of Payens did not merely found an order, he founded an idea. That a man could serve God not only by prayer, but by action. That holiness could walk hand in hand with duty. That the sword, when raised in defense of faith and justice, could be as sacred as the chalice. As the chroniclers would later write, he was the first of the temple, the first to wear the cross, the first to bind courage to humility and war to faith. From his dream rose a company of brothers who carried his spirit beyond his grave. And so, in the twilight of his years, Hugh of Payens left behind no sons, no heirs, no treasure, only a legacy that would echo through the centuries. He left a brotherhood that would guard the Holy Land, shape the politics of Europe, and inspire myths long after its fall. He left behind an idea stronger than stone, an oath purer than gold, that faith and valor together could build a kingdom not of earth, but of heaven. The story of Hugh of Payens closes not with the silence of an ending, but with the echo of a beginning. When he first knelt before the Patriarch of Jerusalem in the early 12th century, there were no banners, no fortresses, no treasures, only faith, a sword, and 9 humble men who believed that service to God could take the form of guarding a road. They had no idea that their small brotherhood, born in poverty and piety, would become one of the most powerful institutions of the medieval world. In the decades after Hugh's death, the order he founded grew with astonishing speed. The Templars' white mantles, once worn by a handful of knights in the Holy City, began to appear across Christendom in France, England, Aragon, Portugal, and beyond. They became living symbols of a new kind of faith, active, disciplined, fearless. Their reputation for courage spread faster than their numbers. Stories of their stand at narrow passes, their defense of pilgrims, and their refusal to retreat even in hopeless battles filled the chronicles of Europe. To the common people, they were warriors of God. To kings and popes, they were instruments of divine will. But behind the grandeur of their rise still beat the quiet heart of Hugh's original vision, that purity was not found in isolation, but in duty, that faith could walk hand in hand with strength. Every commandery built in the West echoed that idea. Every knight who took the vow of poverty repeated the same promise Hugh had made decades earlier, to live not for self, but for God and the brotherhood. The Templars' growth also reflected the changing world around them. Europe was awakening from its early medieval isolation. Trade routes reopened, cities flourished, and the papacy stood at the height of its influence. In this era of faith and ambition, the Templars were perfectly placed, men of prayer and men of action, trusted by both churchmen and kings. They became messengers, financiers, and diplomats as well as soldiers. Wherever they went, their red cross proclaimed that their loyalty belonged to no kingdom of man, but to the kingdom of heaven. And yet, even in their ascent, they carried the humility of their founder. The rule written for them at the Council of Troyes still governed every aspect of their lives. They slept in shared dormitories, ate in silence, and prayed 7 times a day. They trained tirelessly, kept their armor clean, and avoided the luxuries that tempted other knights. Theirs was a life of restraint, proof that even within the glory of war, the soul could remain disciplined. In time, Europe's greatest lords sought to join them or to bury their dead beneath Templar chapels. Donations poured in, not to make the Templars rich, but to sustain the holy war in the East. Every field tilled in Normandy, every vineyard in Burgundy, every farm in England helped feed and arm brothers in the deserts of Palestine. Through this vast network, the order became the lifeline of the Crusader states. The roads they once protected as poor knights were now maintained by their own resources. Caravans moved under their banners, ships sailed under their seal. They were the bridge between Christendom and the Holy Land, an invisible chain of faith stretching from the cathedrals of Europe to the walls of Jerusalem. But beneath this success lay the same question that had haunted Hugh's generation. Could faith and power truly coexist? Could a warrior remain pure while commanding wealth and influence? The Templars themselves pondered this constantly, for their founder had warned them that spiritual decay often hides behind worldly triumph. To many chroniclers, the Templars' early poverty was the source of their holiness, a reminder that their purpose had begun not in castles, but on dusty roads. In this moment of transition, the passing of Hugh's humble dream into a vast institution, we see the birth of the legend. Future generations would remember the Templars as both saints and sinners, heroes and enigmas. But for those who lived in the 1130s, They were still simply brothers of the temple, living and dying for an ideal that transcended their own lives. Imagine then the scene in the Holy Land shortly after Hugh's death. A group of knights gathers at dawn on the Mount of Olives. The sun rises over Jerusalem, turning the stones to gold. They kneel in silence, their swords planted in the ground like crosses. The wind carries the faint sound of church bells from the city below. One brother reads from the rule, "No man should fear to die for Christ, for in his service death is life." They rise, mount their horses, and ride out toward the horizon, not as individuals, but as one body, one spirit, bound by faith. That image captures everything Hugh had hoped for. He had not sought glory, he had sought purpose. And in that purpose, his brothers found immortality. The Templars would continue to grow, to adapt, to build. They would become bankers, diplomats, and commanders of fleets. Their red cross would fly on every frontier of the Christian world. But the spirit that guided them, the belief that service to God could be both contemplative and active, would always trace its lineage back to that first moment in Jerusalem when 9 knights took an oath before the altar of the Holy Sepulchre. The historian William of Tyre, writing a generation later, described Hugh's creation with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He wrote, "They had no worldly glory, no wealth, and yet all men trusted them. Their lives were iron, their hearts were pure." That purity, that unbreakable conviction, became the foundation of the order's identity. It was their greatest strength, and centuries later, it would become their most dangerous vulnerability. But that is a story for another time. For now, we leave them standing at the dawn of their greatness. The year is 1136. The first Grand Master has gone to his rest. The Templar banner still waves above the holy city. And from every monastery and court in Europe, new recruits prepare to take the vow. The dream that began with 9 men has become the hope of thousands. The legend has begun. As the narrator's voice fades, the camera might linger on the symbols of their faith, the sword laid upon the altar, the candlelight flickering across the red cross painted on a shield. Outside, the desert wind rises. The Templar banner, white as purity and crimson as sacrifice, lifts and curls in the air. It is both fragile and eternal, fluttering like the breath of an idea that will never truly die. They began with nothing, the voice says softly. Just 9 men and a dream. And in their dream, they built an empire of faith. One that would shape the destiny of Christendom and leave behind a legend that still haunts the world. The music swells. The light fades. In the distance, we hear the echo of hooves, the clatter of armor, the chant of Latin prayers carried by the wind. The cross still waves, steady, defiant, luminous against the gathering dusk.